Hello, welcome to this clip on the human right to water. So contrary to most of my other clips, this one is about human rights law and is strictly speaking not about international water law or environmental law in a more general sense. So it approaches the issue of water security from a different legal framework, and that's the human rights framework. So we'll see how far we get, but as you will soon find out, we do find a lot of examples of regime integration or interaction in the sense that the human rights framework is interacting with the international water law framework, and in this way they strengthen each other. So we'll see a lot of examples of this in this video. But strictly speaking, we depart from the international legal framework of human rights law and not international water law. If we look at human right to water, basically it has two aspects. So there's the human right of access to drinking water, and there's the human right to sanitation. And often the human right to water is only used to refer to the first aspect, so the right of access to drinking water, and not so much to the right to sanitation, because more and more the human right to sanitation is seen as a separate right, which does have to do a lot with water, but not only. So it's about other things too. And the human right of access to clean drinking water obviously relates solely to water, to fresh water. If you look at the situation on the ground, so what is the proportion of population with access to clean drinking water and to sanitation, you see that we are doing pretty well. So the blue parts of the globe on this slide, those are the parts of the world where, well, the great majority of the population does have access to clean drinking water and to sanitation. I will go to sanitation in a minute. Except for sub-Saharan Africa. So it seems that access to clean drinking water, or lack thereof rather, is a regional problem. A problem that manifests itself primarily in one particular part of the world, and that's sub-Saharan Africa. If we look at sanitation, the situation is a little bit different. So again, sub-Saharan Africa is the main problem, but you also see that certain parts of Asia, especially Southeast Asia, and then more particularly India, that there they also suffer, that they do not manage to guarantee to everyone within their jurisdiction the right of access to sanitation. So here it's still a regional problem, but the region is slightly bigger. So it includes not only sub-Saharan Africa, but also some parts of Asia. But as we will see later, most of the progress is made in Southeastern Asia, especially in China. So that is where most of the progress is made. So, human right to water. You might wonder, where do we find this human right to water? Where is it codified? In which treaty do we find it? Well, that's actually a very tricky question to answer. Because an explicit reference to water in human rights treaties we only find here and there. And these are the most important examples. So that's the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women. It's the Children's Rights Convention, and it's the recently concluded Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability. So in those three conventions you find an explicit reference to water. And so those are the only three universal human rights treaties with an explicit reference to water. For example, in the first convention, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, you find a provision, 14, which guarantees, in particular to women in rural areas, a right to water. So adequate water supplies must be provided to women in rural areas. If we go to the second example, the the Convention on the Rights of the Child, we find that in a provision on the obligation of states to ensure the highest attainable standard of health to all children within their jurisdiction, we find therein an explicit reference to the duty to provide clean drinking water to all children. And then finally, in the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, we find that equal access to clean water services must be provided to both persons without disabilities and persons with disabilities. So here, access to clean water services is linked to equality between people with and without disability. So you might wonder, so do then only women in rural areas, children, and persons with disabilities have a right of access to water to meet their vital needs? And not adult men like me, for example. Well, obviously not. That was never the intention. So even though there's no explicitly formulated human right to water in any of the treaties that apply to all people, instead of to a certain part of the population that is particularly vulnerable, like women, children, or persons with disabilities. So even though there's no explicit human right to water included in any of those treaties, of course, it can be deduced from existing rights. More specifically from Article 11 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which relates to the right of everyone to an adequate standard of living. If you look at the formulation of this right, the right to an adequate standard of living, you find that it refers to adequate food, clothing and housing, and the continuous improvement of living conditions. But it does not refer to water. So it refers explicitly to clothing, food and housing, but not to water. But it's very clear from the way Article 11 is formulated that this was not meant to be an exhaustive list. So even though food and housing and clothing are expressly mentioned, doesn't mean water is not included in that list. And in 2002, the Committee on the International Covenant on Social Economic Rights, issued a general comment 15, in which it affirmed this position. So it affirmed that a human right to water can be deduced from the right to an adequate standard of living. So there's no express reference to water, but implicitly you cannot have an adequate standard of living if you have no access to water. This is obvious. Without access to water, people die. So an adequate standard of living cannot be guaranteed without being provided with access to water. It's obvious, but the committee needed a general comment to make this unambiguously clear. So that the committee did in 2002. And since then, well, it took some time, but since then the international community has slowly come to accept the deduction made by the committee in 2002. So in 2010, the United Nations General Assembly, in which all states of the world have a representative, and the United Nations Human Rights Council, they both affirmed the existence of an internationally recognized human right to water. So it is now clear, it's now very clear that we have an international human right to water, even though it's not explicitly mentioned in any of the traditional human rights treaties. It still does exist. Either it could be deduced from the right to an adequate standard of living, or it could exist in international customary law. So let's now look at regime interaction. So where does the human right to water, how does it affect international water law? Well, this is actually quite simple and obvious. In Article 10, you find a reference to vital human water needs of individual people. And this is often linked to the human right to water. But let me tell you the whole story. So there are two fundamental principles in international water law. That's the principle of equitable and reasonable utilization and the no harm rule. I refer you to my introductory clips on international water law if you want to know more about these principles. But basically, the principle of equitable and reasonable utilization, which is codified in Article 5 of the UN Watercourse Convention, requires of all watercourse states that they use their transboundary waters equitably and reasonably. And that means that they have to balance different uses against each other and thereby reach an equitable balance. All uses have equal weight in reaching this balance, except one, and that is the satisfaction of vital human needs. And so the satisfaction of vital human needs takes priority over all other water uses. And this reference to vital human needs basically sets an international minimum standard. And so every human being in this world should be provided at least with enough water to satisfy its vital human needs. And setting internationally recognized minimum standards of treatment, that's exactly what human rights law does. So it's not far-fetched to interpret vital human water needs in the same way that we interpret human right to water. It's essentially boiling down to the same thing. So there you have regime interaction, integration even. Let me look at another form of integration, and that is integration between human right to water and the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals. So if we look at the list of Sustainable Development Goals, there are 17 of them, we find that they all have something to do with water, or at least most of them do. But there's one that stands out, and that is Goal 6, Sustainable Development Goal 6, which is generally referred to as the water goal. So this one I will elaborate on in a minute. But there are others too. So what is interesting is Sustainable Development Goal 15. In this slide, it's referred to as life on land. So you might wonder, what does life on land have to do with life on water or in water? But the title is a bit deceiving because basically SDG 15 is the ecosystem goal. So it refers to, or it emphasizes, the protection of ecosystems. And there are, of course, terrestrial ecosystems, but there are also freshwater ecosystems. Think of the Danube ecosystem, or the Rhine ecosystem, or the Mekong River ecosystem. So those ecosystems, they have as their beating heart, so to speak, the river. But then everything that is relying on this river is part of that ecosystem. So if you look, for example, at the Danube ecosystem, even the Ukraine, which is situated far away from the actual Danube River, part of the Ukrainian territory is part of the Danube ecosystem. So it draws its resources from this river. So freshwater ecosystems, their protection, conservation, and even restoration is guaranteed by SDG 15. So it's very much about water. What other SDGs can we refer to? Well, obviously, life below water, you might think that may have something to do with freshwater resources, but it doesn't. It's about seawater. So as I told you in my earlier clip, 98% of the world's water we find in oceans and seas, and SDG 14 is about oceans. But this, the human right to water is not about salt water, it's about fresh water. So SDG 14 we can skip. But now let's look in more detail at SDG 6. So SDG 6 has certain targets that have to be met, and also indicators to measure progress in reaching those targets. So by 2030, so that's in 10 years from now, we must achieve universal and equitable access to safe and affordable drinking water for all. Well, if that's not an explicit reference to the human right of access to drinking water, then I don't know what is. And so even though the term human right is not used, obviously this refers to human rights. So how do we measure progress in reaching this target by 2030? So we look at the proportion of the population using safely managed drinking water services. So safely managed drinking water services. So there are some terms used in this indicator that might need some explanation. So what is a drinking water service? A drinking water service is a water source used by households for drinking, cooking, personal hygiene, and other domestic uses. Then you might wonder, what is a safely managed drinking water service? Indicator 611 refers to safely managed drinking water services. And so you might wonder, what is a safely managed drinking water service? Well, that's an improved source that meets 3 criteria. It should be accessible from inside the house. It should also be accessible whenever water is needed. And it should be safe, uncontaminated water. It should provide safe, uncontaminated water. So think of a tap water. In some parts of the world, in most parts of the world, we are very used to having a tap in the house, which we use to draw water from. So that is a safely managed drinking water service. But I made reference to improved sources. So what's an improved source of water? Well, an improved drinking water source is a water source that is constructed in such a way that it can deliver safe water. So its safety, its pristine condition is guaranteed. So think of piped water or boreholes or tube wells or protected dog wells or bottled water, packaged water or delivered water. And so there are many different ways in which safe water can be provided to people's homes. So if we want to manage progress, we have to know where we start. So the SDGs, they look at the proportion of the population with access to water and aims to increase this drastically by 2030. So the SDGs, they start in 2015. So where did we start? As I told you at the beginning of this lecture, we were already quite well underway. So 71% of the world's population already were using safely managed drinking water service in 2015 when we started. So already 71%. And as I told you, this is how we are doing globally. So the main problem is in sub-Saharan Africa and in some parts of Southeastern Asia. So that is the situation in 2015. So where are we now in 2017? The latest figures are of 2017. Well, actually, we haven't made any progress whatsoever. In 2017, the proportion of the world's population with access to safely managed drinking water services was still at 71%. And so we didn't make any progress. And you see that the problem is most persistent in sub-Saharan Africa. So here in this slide, you see that sub-Saharan Africa is considerably lagging behind. And that sort of gives the impression that it's a local problem. It's not a global problem, but a local problem. But that's a bit deceiving, because this is something that should concern us all. should not just be left to sub-Saharan Africa to solve the problem. You see that we are slowly improving, but some parts of the world improve much faster than others. And since 2015, we haven't made that much improvement at all. So here again, situation in 2015 compared with the one in 2017, not much has changed. So where are we going? We have until 2030 to meet the target, the SDG 6 target that relates specifically to implementing the human right to water, the sustainable human right to water. So where are we going? Where are we heading? Well, this is a quote from the 2019 Progress report that was issued late last year. More efficient use and management of water are critical to addressing the growing demand for water, threats to water security, and the increasing frequency and severity of droughts and floods resulting from climate change. Globally, the proportion of population using safely managed drinking water services increased from 61 to 71% between 2000 and 2015. So that's when the Millennium Development Goals were operating. So they were highly successful. But it has remained unchanged since then. So when the Sustainable Development Goals took over from the Millennium Development Goals. And about 800 million people still lack even a basic drinking water services. So we still have a lot to do. We've done our work when it comes to affirming the human right to water as part of international human rights law. That job has been done. But now the challenge is implementation, and we are doing quite well. 71% enjoys their human right of access to water to meet their vital human needs. But we're not quite there yet. Still about 800 million people are lacking.